Ladies, gentlemen, good morning. First of all, I have to apologize because, as you are going to see, unfortunately, we are all male speakers. It's prohibited in my school and also at my institute, and we implement this prohibition of all male panels. But very unfortunately, Frau Curtis was supposed to be with us, but her daughter broke her arm, and Frauke has other emergency priorities this morning that we all understand. However, it's not a formality to have a gender balance in discussions, because what we are going to discuss is of interest for all Europeans and not a particular gender qualified priority. What we are discussing is extremely important. We know that we are in an energy crisis. We know that Russia is at war with Ukraine, but these are deep shocks, are emergency we didn't choose, are things we have to react because it is like this, and there is no other possibility. But apart from this, we still have something we want to do, something very positive, something having an enormous value in itself, which is energy transition, which is climate action. It's a duty, but it's also something fantastic to deliver this transformation. And I am very thankful to George. I know George since 2002. I met him in Oxford, which is very strange, but it's real life. And George is by training an engineer. He has also been chairman of the regulatory office in Portugal, chairman of the European Association of Energy Regulators. But he's innovator like a typical academic, which is very strange to me. He's always full of ideas, full of profound transformations, and he knows how to make them come, which is very, very surprising for me, to be a man of action, also a man of thinking. And from his very interesting report issued a few days ago, I'm taking 4 ideas, and you will see they are fundamental ideas. The first one is that we are looking for energy system integration. We are looking for all kinds of energy sectors, vectors together, because energy silos in the past. In the future, we have to transform everything, and this transformation will go via integration. So silos, we have to quit because of our goals. The second fundamental idea of his report is that to make this energy transformation a success, we need to address, to create, to work with a new level of action and empowerment. Decentralized interaction, or the excellent word from George, local platform. And this is really new. We have to take on board all individuals, all communities, not only companies and governments have to act, but each of us. And this will help us to reach our common goal. In other words, energy transformation will be multi-level and multi-sector, or it won't happen. The third idea is that if all of this is true, multi-level, multi-sector, we have to deeply review our network operation, network planning, network tariff, etc. Because they have to obey our goals, and our goals are multi-level, multi-sector. And to end, the fourth big idea of George, in my view, maybe George will see differently, is that we also need a new governance. Because to guarantee the success of our energy transition being multi-level, multi-sector, we need a new governance. And this governance does not exist yet. We have to create it from the EU level down to citizens, individual prosumers, and community. So a lot of changes, but for the good of humanity. George, you have the floor for 10 minutes. After George, we will go to Claude. Claude is minister in Luxembourg for energy and spatial planning. After that, we'll go to Vicente. Vicente is the president of the European Federation of Energy Law Associations. In between, we hope Christian Zinglersen, the director of the European agency ACER, will arrive. He will speak also for 20 minutes. George will react to all these comments for 5 to 10. And after that, we will take the audience. Audience, you can write questions into the Q&A box. Everybody is ready. George, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Jean-Michel. Good morning to everybody. Let me start by thanking Jean-Michel, Elena, and all the Florence School of Regulation team for having organized this discussion, which is a nice opportunity to discuss again with you and to revisit with you, my old friends and new friends, these topics. Thanks to the panelists, to Claude, to Vicente, Christian, and unfortunately, Frauke is not able to join us. About gender balance, let me tell you something. The report that you may have seen was written by me, and I assume the full responsibility for all the mistakes that it contains. But the manuscript was read by several people. And in fact, the most, let's say, the strongest objections and criticisms and suggestions that I received on the first version of the draft came from two ladies. So I'm very grateful for the female affirmative contributions to this debate. We will have the opportunity, I hope, during the discussion later on, also to enlarge the spectrum of viewpoints. The title of this session today is sounds Shakespearean, to reform or not to reform the energy markets, and this title was proposed more than 1 month ago. And we live in such an accelerated time that I guess this is outdated by now. My feeling is that nowadays nobody questions whether a deep structural reform of European energy markets is needed or not. It's more about how to do it, how to make it happen. And so this report is a contribution to this debate. As I explained at the preface, this is not a handbook. I don't pretend to have a magnificent solution to all our problems. I try to add thinking about the future and how we could make these reforms and where we should start maybe, and what could be the next steps. Thank you, Jean-Michel, because you already summarized very nicely the main ideas of this report. So I'm not going to repeat what you have already said, but maybe I can try to explain the contents of this report from the point of view of the objections that existed and still exist to the very idea of a reform of our EU electricity market. And I think there are three main objections, and I will address them one by one, explaining what is my view on each of them. The first point is fear of losing the internal energy market, and in particular the internal electricity market. Some people believe that if we start a discussion about market design and about the way this internal market works nowadays and how to improve it, that this is like a Pandora's box, and then we may end up with a fragmented European market. We may lose what we have built over the last 25 years. And this would be indeed a pity. And it's not at all obviously my intention with this discussion and with this contribution. I'm very proud of having been able with so many friends to contribute to the construction of the internal market. But what I say in my report is that I want to keep an internal market. I want to keep a structure that allows us to exchange electricity from country to country. But I think that we don't need a single market in the sense of a monopoly. We should not equate internal market with the single market. We can have an integrated European energy market, and we should keep it, of course, and improve it. But this does not mean that this is the only possible way of organizing at all levels our energy, the management of our energy resources. So my view here is that, yes, we want to keep the internal market. Fragmentation is or would be a very sad development, something that we should avoid. But at the same time, we must be open to innovation, and innovation especially at the local level. Therefore, we must look at the internal market, at the internal electricity market in particular, from a different perspective, not from a top-down perspective, but from a much more differentiated perspective. So this is the first fear that I understand some people have talking about EU energy market reform. The second fear is about complexity. Some people tell me, well, I understand what you mean, and especially the importance that you underline regarding energy system integration. By the way, this has been recognized by the European Commission, at least since 2020. But it's so complex. How can we manage bringing together, combining all those energy-related sectors, the electric mobility, electrifying heating, waste to energy, all those things that have to do with energy and have to do with emissions. And at the end of the day, what we are saying here is that the Paris Agreement directly leads us to this idea of system integration. And the place where we can integrate in the most efficient, from the technical and economical point of view, where this integration can be more efficient, is the local level, because it's where those resources and those needs are. And managing those resources in one place, let's say in Paris, is different from managing those resources in Athens or in Bologna or in Oslo or here in Lisbon. And this diversity does not mean that there is an incompatibility between the decentralized approach and keeping an integrated European market. We can combine the two. We know that this is complex, yes, but we also know how to manage this complexity. And my proposal here is to suggest a multi-level and multi-sector architecture. We need an integrated approach to all energy-related sectors. And then we redesign what we have to redesign. We invent what we have to reinvent, but we have a coherent approach to all those developments. And some of those developments, we don't know, very frankly, how they will materialize. Who knows what will be, for instance, the balance between centralized and decentralized storage? I'm not able to tell you today, but I know that we are seeing, and we will see, very interesting developments, both at centralized and at decentralized storage level, for instance. So complexity, yes, it's complex. It's something that requires discussion, that requires changing our mindset, but it's not something that we cannot tackle. We must just be open to innovation in this respect. And this means imagining new energy architectures. And as Jean-Michel was also pointing out, this requires a new governance. And governance is a very important point. Remember, with the clean energy package, there were several legislative proposals, and one of them was this regulation on governance. And at the beginning, nobody thought that it would be important. And then Claude Turmes was the rapporteur in the parliament. He immediately realized the importance of proper governance, and this became one of the most important pieces in the construction of our European energy market. But what we need now is to move further and to introduce a more polycentric governance, okay? A less centralized governance and a much more polycentric governance. The final point is fear about planning. And many people feel that planning is incompatible with free markets. Well, I strongly disagree. Unfortunately, I am not the only person to disagree with that. And if you look at the debate nowadays in England, England was the first country to liberalize the electricity sector. And it's no surprise that England is also the first country to deeply question and challenge nowadays the way this electricity market works in England and the UK. And it's also the country who is talking more openly about planning. But planning should not be seen as an ideological opposition to free market. In my view, it's not that. I'm not at all interested in that kind of ideological barriers. I am very, very much more pragmatic. And what I see is that our market model and the way that our market produces price signals was not able to deliver the necessary transmission network investments in electricity. And in gas, we could say that if we look at the present situation, that indeed the price signals were completely wrong. But let's stick to electricity. We're looking at the statistics, looking at the facts. It's a fact that those wholesale price signals were unable to produce the necessary development of the transmission network. Now, when we come to the local level and to the development of those local platforms, we are not talking about electricity only as a silo, as we did in the past with liberalization. Here we must combine different local public policies on mobility, on urban planning, on waste management, on so many things. And it's impossible that any wholesale market or retail market will provide the necessary signals for the expansion, the necessary expansion of the local platforms, because this is always a political decision. This is a political trade-off between different legitimate interests. And citizens, we as citizens, we also have different interests as pure electricity consumers, but as consumers of mobility or consumers of heat. And we have to combine those different interests in our home and in our city. And this is a political process. Planning for me is just the layer between the political decision, the political agreement on the way we are going to manage the energy transition at the local level, and the creation of the infrastructure that enables then the markets, the local markets, to be activated. So I think that instead of believing that price signals will produce the necessary investments for the expansion of the local platforms, we should assume in a more pragmatic way that we need some planning at this level. And once we agree in a very transparent way about what this infrastructure, what this platform should look like, then I'm pretty sure that innovation will come and that different approaches and different market mechanisms will be introduced. So these are the three basic fears that I see, the three major objections, and the way I believe we can respond to those objections. But I'm very glad now to listen to your own objections and suggestions. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, George. Claude, do you feel ready to jump? 1, 2, 3, jump.
So good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, George, for all the thoughts that it's only you, it's a whole team. Thank you also, Jean-Michel and the Florence School of Regulation for organizing this exchange. So I pretty much agree with Jorge that first, the internal market is important. And especially, I would say, in Western Europe, but also in all the countries around the Baltics, the supply will be a combination of very local sources, solar, and above all solar and some local wind, and then these gigantic new capacities which will emerge from the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. So you have seen the recent statement from the 4 prime ministers of Belgium, Netherlands, Germany and Denmark, moving from 15 gigawatts to 65 and then 250 gigawatt of offshore wind. So the future will be a combination of large-scale offshore wind and local. And in that respect, I think it's very, very important that we keep a market platform which is basically almost all Europe. And then, of course, Jorge has a point that this deep revolution of going completely out of all fossils in heating, all fossils in that will bring completely new and I think the main challenge will be flexibility and storage. And my first question to Jorge would be, what do we really need to emerge in this local platform? And my best guess would be we need to test and to bring to reality local balancing or local flexibility markets, because that will also help us to basically have a bit less of stress to the modernization or to the extension and the investments into the local distribution networks. And then, of course, at this local level, district heating systems run on low temperature. We collect waste heat industry, waste heat from data center, which will then use heat pumps to go from 20-25 degrees to higher. So that will, of course, a new component in the energy system. And I think we need to have a better understanding of how do we organize the governance between basically electricity input, which comes from outside, and then these new local district heating systems, which will be a combination of heating and cooling, but where heat pumps will play a big role, and that will, I think, bring an intersection also with the electricity market. So the question to you, Jorge, when you speak about local markets, shouldn't we concentrate at the first on local storage flexibility markets and basically trying to integrate also the electricity system with these low temperature district heating systems? So on the third point on planning, I think I pretty much agree. We are in a race against climate change. We know that we have to go much faster, and therefore we need to have a planning approach. I think a pure market approach will never get us where we have to be. And Fatih Birol has, I think, put the challenge for the electricity system, which is all developed countries need 100% decarbon, 100% renewable power system in 2035, not in 2050. So, and in order to get there, we need to speed up things. That is also, I think, now well recognized, also in the new REPower document on everything which is linked to authorizations. And in that respect, I think the one of the difficult time issues is building out the grid for integration of these huge offshore wind capacities, and that is cable, of course, in the North Sea or the Baltic Sea. That may be fast, but what is probably more difficult is once these huge quantities are landing, how do you integrate them in the existing power system? And in order to get a better view on that, at the level of the Pentalateral Forum, which is Germany, France, Benelux, Austria, Switzerland, which Luxembourg is chairing this year, we are now organizing an exercise to model, at least roughly, how so the huge quantities which will come from the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, and then can the existing Western European power grid, can it digest these quantities? And if the electricity grid is not sufficient, of course, what is the intersection with a possible green hydrogen network? And I think Jorge has a point that probably we need also to add into this the low, the faster we go on local PV and integrating it, maybe that can relieve some of the stress also in building out this grid at the conventional level. And then maybe a last issue, the one question which I think we don't yet have an answer is, in the internal market and in the pay as clear market or clear as pay market, the last power plants are setting the price. These last power plants will be gas, and after gas it will be green hydrogen. And green hydrogen will not be cheap. So for me, the question which is still open and which is maybe for me or at least a very urgent question is, how do we design, how do we basically improve the market design of the today internal power market and the trading floors, in knowing that the merit order of will be dominated by gas and by green hydrogen, and that both are very expensive. And how can we hedge against this? How can we basically organize a price setting which is not completely jeopardized by the fact that gas will be expensive over the next at least 2 or 3 years, and then we need to phase out fossil gas, and then will come green hydrogen, which is also expensive. So I think we need also an answer to that question. So that would be my first thoughts.
Merci, Claude. We are welcoming Christian. I assume that Christian came exactly when Claude was talking about marginal plants and marginal pricing, but maybe Christian needs 4 time to accommodate. Maybe it will be astute to ask Vicente to jump, and Christian will have time to see how to intervene. To Christian, I am reminding that Vicente is president of the European Federation of Energy Law Associations. Vicente, you have the floor for 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, Jean-Michel. Good morning to all. It is again a great pleasure for me to participate in this seminar. My gratitude for the Florence School of Regulation, and of course to his director, Jean-Michel, for inviting me to participate in this very special conversation. And my congratulations for the organizing this event and this exchange under this intellectual space. George Vasconcelos present us with a high quality reflection. Decades is achievements and
Maybe you should close your video, Vicente. Maybe by closing your video, your voice will be better. Ah.
No.
Nevertheless, Vicente,
Yeah,
I think you should
now.
close your video and try to restart your slides. If you are unable,
I think on that sense, I need some help from Elena. Elena, it would.
Elena Iorio, could you take over?
Of course, I will share your slides and you can just speak and we hear you. Thank you.
Merci, Elena. Very.
Again, merci,
nice.
Elena. Also, well, as I was saying, it's the document, in my view, is prepared under the imperative of the decentralization, which needs to be promoted. The document is, of course, a cultural, well-documented and critical text that identifies challenges of markets and energy supplies, elaborates consistently about the new energy architecture coming from the clean package, underlines the governance dimension, multi-level, multi-sector, and incorporates relevant reflections about the transition, retail prices, flexibility, and control flow. Very comprehensive and positive. The bottom line is that we are living in a period that calls for a profound transformation of the energy market, regulated, and the free one, and as a consequence of the sector itself. A reform required by climate policy as a central and prior policy in the evaluation of industrial action and economic policy. And by the enormous dynamism of energy technological innovation accelerated by digitalization. 4 years have already passed since the adoption of the clean energy package. In some cases 4, in some others 5. The directive or in internal market, the directive of promoting renewables energy. And there is still a fundamental work of transposition of the substantial content, material content of the directives pending, in my view. The architecture of clean energy package was based not only on the necessary technical adjustment of the previous package, but also on the preparation of the transition from the internal energy market to the internal energy and climate market. In this context, too, a new activity is incorporated into the sector's value chain, the energy storage, and new demand-side actors are recognized from the prosumer to the energy communities, to some extent, energy digital communities. In other words, the need for a new decentralized industrial organization is recognized, and consequently, the affirmation of local markets as platforms with flexibility are the essence, or should be one of the main elements of the new model. In legal terms, there are a lot of things to be considered. First, the definition and the presentation of a core or principles of the energy law, as it has happened, or in the field of environmental law in 1986 with the adoption of the Single European Act. But in material terms, also there are some very, in my view, some very important elements to be considered, analyzed, and incorporate into the legislative core. Some part connected with the definition and of the service of general economic interest, whose evolution linked to technological innovations require some inclusions of the elements and actors of the demand side of the electricity, and I would say of the energy sector as such. Also, amend the regulation as necessary in order to promote decentralization of the internal electricity market, adapting to some extent the role of the TCOs and assigning new tasks to the DCOs for this purpose, modify or analyze the possible modifications on some domestic legal frameworks to enable effective participation of aggregation in all electricity market could be considered. Adapt the European and national public procurement rules to collective self-consumption and the schemes of the energy communities of electricity to the new reality, removing some barriers of entry. I think it could be also explored. And also analyze some barriers that create obstacles for the development of distributed energy resources, storage that has been rightly mentioned, self-consumption, electric vehicles, all these distributed assets that participate, and it could participate in a very dynamic way in the decentralized industrial energy model. Encourage a peer-to-peer transaction and establishing, as you mentioned, I completely fully agree, the adequate combination and coordination between the central market, regulated and free market, with the local platforms or local markets. I took, and I allow myself as a lawyer to create these, to design this slide, taking advantage of the principle of positive discrimination in my favor in this case, and entitle this a bottom-up redesign of internal electricity market. In fact, this title, it doesn't describe as such what I pretend with this slide. In fact, what I pretend is to explore the possibility on this formulation of some sort of balance or coordination between the European global markets in the terms that has already been explained with the new local markets or local platforms. In other words, the aggregation, self-consumption, the storage always in the middle, and the sectors that are around, mobility, residential, of course, green technologies, and waste to energy, heating and cooling, of course, as a new greener infrastructures. I would like to reiterate my congratulations to Jorge for this exercise. I think it's a very challenging and necessary exercise. I think this sector, the energy sector, from the technological point of view, is already prepared to assume and to open these sort of challenges. It is a great work, thoughtful, profound, original, and necessary. It highlights that the two major drivers of change in governance of the energy sector, in my view, are the primacy of climate policy over industrial action and economical policy, and the enormous development of technological innovation, mainly on the demand side, because of the strength of these changes, technological changes coming from the decentralized, from the, if you like it, from the decentralized side. If we take a look of the clean energy package, and we search for the word innovation or the word decentralization of the word local markets, there are a very few occasions under which we could find it. And instead, the main elements of change in the directive of review of internal energy market are the storage, the aggregators, the prosumers, the self-consumption, and the energy communities. This is sort of a bit contradiction. In the first page of his report, Jorge quotes, "This text is not a conventional report, and certainly it is not, neither in form or content, neither in quality. It is a real contribution, a conceptual framework. The central element of this change is determined by the proximity of generation and resources to the consumer. Always we mention that we have to look and to enrich this consumer-centric vision. And I think as a consequence of the many changes that from one reason or another, some, as we all know, very dramatic, we are living, we are impelled to consider very rapidly in the sense of urgency. And thus, by the development of these new local platforms or markets. Aristotle wrote, "The nature of everything is best seen in his smallest portions." I think that's important to note. Thank you very much.
Many thanks to you, Vicente. So the audience noticed that you, Vicente, like me, you can tell everything you think because you are totally free of everything you support. We have heard also from Claude. Claude he's a free person, but he's also minister in the country, and he has been leader of the European Parliament. And now we are going to Christian. Now Christian is facing constraint because Christian has a role. He is the director of the European agency, and he cannot change his mind every morning. He has to keep consistency, but his agency issued a fantastic report a little bit less than 1 month ago, let's say 3 weeks ago. And Christian, how do you see the need for reform in the EU? You have heard Claude saying, okay, but we will have price spikes in the future. How can we hedge from these to impede them to derail the way consumer perceives the energy market, etc., etc. Your report, the ACER report, is looking at emergency short-term measures, but also to long-term new tools helping us to guarantee this or that. So you have the floor for, let's say, up to 10 minutes to give us our views.
Thanks a lot, Jean-Michel. Apologies to you, to George, Vicente, Claude, and the participants for dialing in late. I had weather issues, so to say, in that sense, navigating a bit of a hailstorm here in Copenhagen. So apologies for that. I'd say a few words per your question, Jean-Michel, and then maybe also dedicate a bit of time to George's report, which I have read, of course. I've also interacted with George on several occasions and have benefited a lot from that, actually. Indeed, the report that we put out a little over 3 weeks ago made the proposition that there are benefits in short-term electricity market, wholesale electricity market functioning currently, but there is very likely a need to supplement them with increasingly well-functioning longer-term markets, given the future we see ahead. So this is a report which is predominantly dedicated to the EU wholesale electricity market, and that's where we make that recommendation. And I'd like maybe in a few minutes also come in on some of the dilemmas or challenges in that, which I think also George's report actually alludes to. Indeed, more well-functioning longer-term markets give a need to hedge one's risk in a very capital-intensive investment type of future system that we look into. Has a number of implications. There are also implications, I think, at the consumer level, to what extent they should be exposed to a lot of the different spikes and whatnot, but also the dilemmas associated with perhaps not exposing them in terms of having a more demand responsive type of system and what to target. So maybe drawing on a few of those elements and coming to George's report, which I'd like to spend a bit of time on as well. I'm assuming, George, that you highlighted some of the main elements at the outset before I joined you, right? For the audience, yeah. So I would join Vicente in saying that I found and find it a very stimulating report. It's a thought-provoking report. I think it is written in George's customarily punchy style, where he takes up an elephant and puts it in the room squarely and firmly, which I really appreciate. And it may, in my opinion, may very well characterize significantly a sizable portion of the energy system future. And I would also agree with what you said, Vicente. I also see it as a contribution which focuses a lot on what the implications of localized developments, what they will have on the wider system. So from that perspective upwards, I think was your formulation, Vicente, a little bit. I agree with that. And it also, in my view, puts some legitimately strong questions on the table as far as the role of system planning for the future. And what will, shall we say, what will inform such system planning? Will it be quote unquote only price signaling and, shall we say, quantitative analysis of what is right and what? Hopefully there's a role for that, but I think your point, George, is there is very much additional to that type of analysis to inform system planning. So I would maybe highlight a few elements where I think there are questions that your report, George, touches upon in terms of what is the balance or the relative weight of certain developments. And the first balance there, I think, is between localized markets and the wholesale market, or the centralized market, or the continental wild market, if you'll allow that expression. That's a difficult prediction to make, obviously. It'll be informed by a number of different things. Some of that is cost efficiency, some of it is preference and policy priorities, obviously. I would think whatever the relative weight is, there will be a coexistence, and one then needs to find out how to manage that well, that coexistence. And you allude to a lot of that in your report, George, rightly so. I think there could be a lot of solutions provided at the local level, which need not necessarily be harmonized and look identical. I think that is one of your key points, George. I would agree with that. The question then becomes the coexistence model for what will still remain at the wholesale level, centralized level, or even continental wide level. And one example that George and I have discussed a bit in the past is, say, the offshore ambitions, which have recently been given a bit of oomph by a number of announcements. That is a utility scale vision at scale, so to speak, if ever I saw one. And that energy generated, whether it will remain in electron form or molecular form, whatever, is of a size where it will probably furnish a significant portion of continental Europe, also outside those countries who may have those facilities. So that's the centralized approach, and that coexistence is then what will be the relative weight of such elements. I think the other balancing there is planning versus, shall we say, strict economic signals. I think you make a number of good points in terms of an increasingly system integrative model, not least at the urban level, will have a number of implications for planning, and will bring decision makers also at the localized level to the fore, and a number of choices in build out will need to be made. I would hope that a portion of those choices will also be informed by cost-benefit analysis, as it were, because there are different choices in terms of infrastructure investments to be made. But definitely, I would also see that sort of the era of planning is increasing, as it were, and that is also at the continental wide scale or level. But I think one of your key points is, George, that will very much also happen at the localized level, and it will appear differently in different jurisdictions, obviously. So I think I would maybe mention, maybe it follows from what I just said, but sort of maybe three sort of challenges up ahead, or dilemmas, maybe even. One is, shall we say, driving generation investment. What is market? What is off market? And indeed, we've discussed a bit in the past, George. We make the point in our report, let's have better functioning longer term markets so as to complement what are, in my view, relatively well functioning shorter term markets. And part of that is the focus on the ability to hedge. But then the question a little bit becomes, if a lot of investment is off market and has been off market, and one is not really exposed that much by virtue of that to risk and price risk, why would you hedge? So what type of spiral are you going down if that increases? Or less and less liquid? Or is there a bit of a turning point at some future, where you look at support schemes and investment facilitative arrangements, whereby there is still an element of risk, and therefore there is still value in hedging, and therefore there is still value in looking at liquidity issues and so forth. I think that is a bit of a dilemma, and I don't know to what extent maybe there is like a crossroads up ahead where one needs to say, okay, how will this massive investment needed at speed and at scale, what type of route to go? Is that a route where you want market actors to invest with a significant portion of risk to be handled by them? Or is it a different route one wants? I think that has implications for how to look at the relative weight of, shall we say, longer term markets, stimulating them vis-a-vis, a different type of model. And I think you allude to that dilemma well. The second is on infrastructure, and I think what we sometimes dub sort of infrastructure scarcity. There's obviously congestion at local level and at central level, and maybe this issue of having access to the network will become one of increasing significance for the future. So I think that brings up the issue of planning once more, but also what's the role of cost-benefit analysis in that? What is the value of avoided investment in infrastructure, where the access to infrastructure may in some instances be increasingly a scarce good? So that is sort of another dilemma. And thirdly, one is sort of, maybe this is putting planning back into the spotlight fully. It's and again, I agree with you that the role of planning is likely to increase very significantly. And that is in this context of a more managed transition, which I see up ahead. And by managed transition, I see, by that I would see sort of a transition process, which is perhaps less focused on supply side targets, as it were, and more complemented by looking at also at the demand side measures and how it will all work, and how one can sort of manage that process. I think one slightly provocative assertion currently is that we are in an energy price crunch, maybe because that managed transition was not managed that well. Not to say that it'll be super smooth sailing and easy breezy, no, not at all, but I think there is an opportunity if in the more managed transition pathway, where you look at both sides of the aisle and tackle it a bit pragmatically with a significant role for planning, that maybe some of the worst spikes and peaks and shocks can be, if not avoided, then at least mitigated. So that would be the third one. The role of planning, I agree with you, would increase, and I think it's even more likely to increase in this managed transition phase, which I think we are learning some lessons on how to perform or not to perform. Maybe I leave it at that. Maybe it was roughly 10 minutes, maybe 8-9 minutes. Maybe I leave it at that, and happy to discuss further on the basis of your report. George, thank you for that contribution.
And congrats, Christian, to be so frank. While having heavy responsibilities, you are very frank, and I appreciate, because it helps us to understand where we are, what are the options for the future, and what we did into the past that we might have done differently, but we didn't, so we are there. Jorge, you have the floor for at least 10 minutes, but before that, I would like to remind to the audience that you should use the Q&A box to ask questions. I had one from José Villar, and this question is really good, but I would like to have 10 questions to ask George and the speakers. George, you have the floor, 10 minutes. How do you react to all of these comments?
Thank you very much for your comments. Excellent points that I believe could justify a series of seminars like this one. Of course, we are all somehow biased. We have all our preferences and our history. And I think the beautiful thing about discussions like this one is that we are able to very freely be self-critical and critical. And I think that's the only way forwards if we want to really move forward to correct some of the mistakes that we have made collectively in the past, not necessarily the 4 or 5 of us, but many people, and to imagine and to design a different future. So we don't have much time, and I think also it would be very good to have the participants participating. So very, very briefly, I will try to cover the different points, starting following the order. So starting with Claude's first point on local platforms as an engine for providing flexibility. Well, it's interesting that flexibility is one of the most used concepts nowadays, not being defined in any directive or regulation for the moment. And why? Because it's so difficult and it means different things. And what I believe is that this border between what is flexibility and what is something else, what is a kind of a standard product, can be a mobility product, a heat product, it can be something else. This will probably vary, change over time and over geographies. We may very well see some system control problems, be it congestion management or frequency control or voltage control, being tackled by different means in different places. And there is nothing wrong with that. So what I see is that we have tried in the past to standardize flexibility and to require that even charging a small car should be done according to the centralized concept of flexibility, and all flexibility resources should be centralized management. I say, well, let's let 1,000 flowers bloom and let local platforms find the most appropriate solutions. Whether this will be called flexibility or something else, because some products that may be traded at the local level include all the necessary requirements to solve the local problems and providing the network operators in charge of ensuring reliability and security of the infrastructure, the necessary resources, that's fine. So I don't have a definition. I think it's better not to standardize this, allowing for diversity at the local level and the creativity of the market players to come with solutions. What we need to define very carefully are the reliability criteria at local level and what should be this reliability interface between the local platforms and the centralized system. And that's all what we should try to define. But please, we should do that. We should recognize that this definition of the interfaces is complex. It requires a lot of negotiation, but it's absolutely crucial. And let me ask, why did we Europeans fail creating a standard for smart metering? Smart metering is just one piece of digitalization, but an important one. Why didn't we replicate in the energy sector the big success of GSM, the second generation of mobile phones? If we had done that, that would have been good, not only for our electricity consumers and energy consumers in Europe, but also in other places. Look at the impact that this de facto standardization brought to the diffusion of telecommunications in Africa, in the developing world, not only in the developed countries. So I think that we must be more ambitious, think that energy can also be part of a sound industry policy. And this is exactly the area where we in Europe are very good. Our research centers, our industries, we can do that. We need a little more of, let's say, clarity about these definitions. The second point is about planning, and in particular, the role of offshore, and also Christian has brought this point, how to combine the development of local platforms with the very big, large-scale offshore facilities. I think that this idea of the big offshore facilities is a very good idea. But we must be, again, coherent and try to decide upon the consequences. And for me, it's very clear, if we accept this idea of very large offshore power plants, whatever the internal management and governance of those multinational big factories, big power plants is, there will be a huge impact upon the continental interconnected system. What I mean by this is that, again, we are talking about planning, we are talking about cost and benefit sharing, and this cannot be decided by the 4 or 5 countries who decide to make this investment, because if there is no coherent planning throughout the interconnected system, this investment can be stranded. If we are not going to build the huge amounts of transmission capacity in continental Europe, then this is completely useless. And this requires that people accept now, which they did not accept at the onset of liberalization, which is to talk very frankly about the costs and benefits of interconnectors and how to share that. We found a compromise that enabled us to start cross-border electricity trade. But look at the example that I give in my report about from the gas sector concerning these interconnectors between Spain and France. It clearly shows that we cannot continue making network planning as we did in the past. We must be very, very open about the benefit and cost sharing. If we do this, then we have a completely different planning methodology and planning governance at the centralized level, and it will be maybe also easier from there to coordinate with the local planning, because then we are not pretending anymore that the wholesale market prices are driving investments on infrastructure, on networks. The third point is about the long-term view, and again, it's a point that is present in ACER's report and was mentioned by Christian. Those new plants that we need for the transition, they are expensive, be it gas, be it the big offshore plants, be it green hydrogen. Well, what we see is that this is all, one way or the other, state guaranteed. You can call it, don't call it feed-in tariffs because it's not fashionable anymore, but nowadays we call it CFD, you call it investment support, you call it recovery fund support, whatever. At the end of the day, it's always the same. It's a state guaranteed price one way or the other with maybe different strings attached, but the basic concept is that we are creating now a reality that is off market. And this is the reality. So the question is how we want to introduce those new animals in our zoo. But we clearly must address this in a very explicit way. Thanks, Vicente, for all your comments and even for being an excellent designer and engineer and providing some very good pictures to illustrate those ideas. And also for reminding us about the importance of the legal dimension. And, you know, one of the fears that maybe I did not mention at my introduction, but which is also a real one, at least from some people in Brussels, is the fear of becoming jobless if we go in the decentralized direction. Then what would the European Union do? What would the European Commission do? And I think there is a lot of things to do, and very useful things, not necessarily trying to impose the same harmonized flexibility definitions everywhere in Europe. But look, for instance, at what happened with this concept of the energy communities that was introduced in the clean energy package. It has been disruptive in so many jurisdictions, starting with my own here in Portugal, where the government back in 2019 understood the potential of those energy communities, not only for households, but also for industrial customers. If now the Commission, not now, but already in October with the toolkit, put so much emphasis on corporate PPAs, on long-term PPAs, is because starting with this idea of communities, we realize that this can be a very interesting solution for many people. So the legal framework and the impulse that comes from directives and regulations is extremely important. And it's also financial support to the municipalities if we are serious about this energy system integration at the local level, we need not only a new governance, but we need also people. We need skills. We need people who are able to understand the complexity at the local level, to design the appropriate technical and governance solutions to manage this local complexity. And this requires dissemination of good practices. This requires a lot of support. And this support can be provided by the European Union also as a means to accelerate the transition, because you always can learn from experiences in other places, and because cooperating sometimes may be very useful to develop codes of conduct, to develop new standardized products, local products. All this can be discussed among those in charge of the local realities, but the European Union does not need to be absent. On the contrary, not only by the legal framework, but also by financial support, they can be extremely present and be extremely useful. Moving to Christian's remarks quickly. On your three points of balances or trade-offs, the local versus centralized and the offshore problem, well, I already addressed it. I hope that we can live with both, but this clearly requires a profound revision of the way we do planning, we look at our planning. Cost-benefit analysis, of course, has a role to play. And I am supporting that, but we should also not exaggerate the importance, because at the end of the day, we are talking about very important political decisions, because if we are going to invest so much on these offshore plants or on expensive green hydrogen, is because we believe that this is good for our security of supply. So this is a price to pay. And remember the experience with the UK-France cable, which was decided in the 1980s. And some cost-benefit analysis were in fact done. And you know what was the outcome of this analysis? It was that 50% of the time the electricity would flow from the UK to France, and 50% of the time from France to the UK. After 20 years of functioning, it was 98% in one direction and 2% of the time in the other direction. Nevertheless, a very useful project for economic reasons, for political reasons, all of this. So we should also be more modest about the real impact of cost-benefit analysis. The second point about planning versus price signals. Well, maybe because I am so exasperated with the lack of investment at transmission level when it should have taken place. I mean, at the onset of liberalization. And if I look at the complexity at the local level of what we want to develop now at the local level, or even at the huge scale of these huge North Sea, Baltic Sea projects, then I see no way to solve this infrastructure problem with price signals coming from dysfunctioning wholesale markets. Dysfunctioning also because we have more than 50% of the installed generation capacity nowadays with the state guaranteed price, and all that is before us as a state guaranteed price. So it must be dysfunctional by definition. So we need to be much more pragmatic about the development of the infrastructure. And I don't see any problem agreeing on more planning, especially at the local level. And I'm pretty sure that this will act as the internet. Once you create internet and you open it to everybody, you will see new business models that we are not even able to imagine today happening. And if the legal framework, again, you see the importance of the legal and the regulatory framework, just enables this kind of innovation to take place, and using the infrastructure that is provided for mobility, for heating, for all the new applications, this will happen. Demand management will happen if we have an improved local infrastructure. And nobody knows what the outcome will be. Of course, this has to be closely observed by regulators to make sure that there is no abuse of dominant position, that we are not creating new monopolies or things like that. But please let us create this. I don't like the expression, but the Internet of Energy. Let's create this local platform, as I call it, and then let's see what happens, how the market works. Because if the market can work, if creativity and innovation can take place in the near future and leading us to 2030 to decarbonization, it is at the local level. And well, we have many other interesting points, but I think I should stop here. Otherwise, I will monopolize the time.
I'm afraid you have, because we have interesting questions from the audience, and the audience is always right asking questions. Of course, anybody in the panel can intervene. Jorge has no monopoly. It can be Claude, can be Christian or Vicente. From José Villar, do we really need such a big reform, or is it just a matter of relaxing national regulation to really allow local dynamic and flexible markets, which is not really the case now? Who wants to say something? Maybe Claude. Claude, you are minister, but you are a former parliament leader. So what don't you do it in Luxembourg? Why should we need a European reform to take initiative at the national level?
Of course, in Luxembourg, we are also working on the local cooperatives and this kind of sharing of energy. But I think we have, in a certain sense, if grid building takes time, I think mobilizing 50, 60, 70% of society to be peer-to-peer PV traders, that will also take time. And in that respect, in Luxembourg, what we are doing is we are now creating a national energy data platform. And my aim is to start with the big animals, so that this energy data platform will first allow the industry consumers to be much more active on demand side management, and then going to the office buildings before going to the let's say each and every small individual. So that's a bit our strategy. But I think digitalization and what George basically mentioned before, in Luxembourg we have the advantage. We have a 99% rollout of smart meters, and so we can now use this data to allow this kind of more informed of where is demand side, and then also to organize this kind of local platforms, because the data infrastructure has now been built up.
Vicente, okay, go.
Yes, thank you, Jean-Michel, and very interesting comments, Claude. But I believe that it is needed both sources of law, the European law and the domestic law. The European law for the reasons that has been explained, and also because it's important to fix the principle of primacy of European law and to facilitate the appropriate development and deployment and elaboration of national law with this endorsement of the European rules in the terms that has also analyzed George at the end of his explanations. Besides, I do believe the national law, and is a good example what we are now living with the transposition of the clean energy package, needs more levels of more layers of implementation and more determination and enforcement on this implementation, even with the pure ingredients that we do have now in the clean energy law to deploy these local platforms and local markets. Because to some extent, in the clean energy package, we were good in terms of in terms of declarations. The declarations were okay, were good. We have a new stockholders from the space of the demand side. We have recognized and identified them, prosumers, consumers, energy communities, but we haven't developed these figures accordingly. George also mentioned before the definitions of the directive with the example of the flexibility. If I take into account, talking by heart, the definitions, just directive of internal market and regulation of internal market, there are more than 130. And there has not appear little bit slightly flexibility, as I mentioned before, innovation, energy communities, well, a broad definition that needs to be converted into these energy digital communities instead of these levels of cooperation with other entities starting by the local communities. And I also agree with Claude with regard to the difficulties, but I fully believe that this is an exercise of changing our mindset, as you said in your initial words, Jean-Michel. If we change our mindset, the business plans would fly very rapidly. And the sort of developments and innovations that we are seeing in the decentralization market in the last couple of years are huge. And the capacity to accelerate these sort of innovations in the local markets in connection and coordination with the central markets are also very substantial. And I think we have to take into account these elements for the next future, but it would be in the benefit of Europe as a whole and the domestic markets in particular.
Many thanks. George, Christian, do we know enough, or you want to add important things?
I wouldn't mind going to Hélène's question once you think this.
Okay, but then I'm okay. Pam, pam, pam. Hélène Veil or Veil, depending the way you want to say it. In France, we say Veil. Why reforming when many provisions on the clean energy package and even the third energy package are yet to be implemented or are subject to national derogations? For example, the 70% rule, market-based redispatch, etc. If a new reform is put on the table, how to ensure that it is swiftly and effectively implemented? What does a managed transition mean? Christian.
It's a two-pronged question at least, so a good one. So I'd like to kick that one off, if it's all right.
Yeah.
So on the first part of the question, how about implementing what has already been agreed? That I would definitely agree with. We put a bit of emphasis on that in our report back in late April. The 70% rule, that is making cross-border capacity available for trade, is a good example of that. I think that is still, well, not only is it worth doing, it's worth accelerating. There are actually quite varying approaches to that from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and I think that is relatively unhelpful. There's also, I think, a good case for continuing, perhaps also speeding up some of the market coupling projects, which have been significantly delayed. That will make for more efficient integration. This is at the wholesale market level, so it does not touch upon what I think you were mentioning, George, about this possible repositioning of the interplay, as it were. So I think this is very much worth doing, and I would not see that being contradicted by some of George's recommendations, but he can speak to that if he, of course. The second part of the managed transition, indeed, this is another nebulous term, right? Flexibility is nebulous, managed transition is nebulous, etc. So I'll say a few things what I mean about it, at least. And maybe I'd approach it from what has perhaps been less of a managed transition, if we look back a bit. So I think one of the reasons, well, we can all agree we are in an energy crunch right now because of specific actions of a particular third country and unhealthy dependencies on that particular country. I think that is basically a relatively consensus type view. But leaning up to that, say over the last 10 years or so, IEA put forward some soft-worded words of caution some years ago about the level of investment in fossil fuels were relatively low, also relatively low vis-a-vis an ambitious decarbonization trajectory. I think that was, I was working in the Danish government at that time, and I probably were a little bit dismissive of that. So low investment in that, we're going through an energy transition, that means higher prices, this is good for the alternatives, the low carbon solutions, etc. But I do think in hindsight, they had a bit of a point, that if there are significant underinvestment and one does not tackle demand sufficiently or in time, you risk going into a shock type of environment. Now that was coupled, I think, in significant parts of Europe not doing enough clean energy investment at the same time. So arguably the alternatives to that were underinvested in, not everywhere, but in some places. So you had a little bit of a crunch coming. And I think it was disguised a bit by the fact that arguably we had significant overcapacity towards 2009, 2010, etc. So up to the financial crisis. So you had a bit of a buffer, obviously to the detriment of many utilities who really suffered for a number of years in the last 10 years. But sort of from the system level, you had a bit of a buffer. So it was disguised a bit. And now, of course, the crunch came with a freight train from the east. So that arguably, from my perspective, has been not so managed, if you will. I mean, it's not so managed a transition. It makes for a shock. And that has a number of implications which are not so healthy. So going forward, what I would think is when one targets certain supply side issue, whether it's more rapid phase out of gas or more rapid phase out of gas originating from a certain jurisdiction, etc., one needs to pay a lot of attention not only to the alternatives in the supply side, but also on the demand side. How can that actually be accommodated and facilitated in a way which does not lend itself to so many shocks? And I think, Claude, you will know much better, but I think a number of discussions at political level focus exactly on that. What are the accompanying measures to make this, shall we say, manageable, broadly affordable, but also what are some of the trade-offs associated with it? But let's face it, I mean, there are trade-offs. If you want to rapidly go out of a certain source, there are some trade-offs, not just in terms of cost, but also in terms of climate. So that sort of managed transition, I think that's what I mean by it. But as a nebulous term, it has many meanings to many men and women. I agree. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you very much. On the first point about whether it would be enough to fully implement the fourth package and even the third package, yes and no. It would be nice, of course, if all the member states always respect the deadlines, and this could have helped, and this could help. But I think there is a risk here, and the risk is that we keep the continuity, and this will not deliver what we need in terms of getting rid of the fossil fuels as soon as possible and decarbonizing as soon as possible. We need a different mindset. And this means that we have to review the targets. The target models that we have in mind for gas and electricity are not valid anymore. Many of the basic assumptions of the present markets are not valid anymore. And this is now the time to accept this. And my hope is that the European Council next week will accept also unanimously this new reality. And then we'll tell Christian, well, well done. You have a nice report. We believe that we need to go much farther. So please come with a new report and tell us how these big projects in the North Sea can be combined with the local platforms. And please give us a blueprint for this very fast forward transition to a decarbonized world. I hope this is what will happen, that we all accept that we need a new mindset, and that it is not just more of the same. It's something different and something new, which must be based on different assumptions than the ones we had back in 2016 or 2009. And this has to do also with the concept of managed competition, which, by the way, is not a new concept, or managed transition. Let me tell you what non-managed transition is. A non-managed transition is, for instance, the mantra that we have heard for so many years, that everything should be technically neutral, that the market should decide whether they go for PV or onshore wind or offshore wind or this or that. Okay, that was the mantra. And now we are talking about a huge project of offshore wind in one part. We are talking about huge hydrogen projects in other parts. We are talking about this and that, and everything is decided politically. I can agree or disagree. I can agree or disagree with the cost benefits or with the technical feasibility studies that are presented. I am a citizen. I have the right to vote. But I prefer, frankly, I prefer to live in a world where the decision makers take their responsibility and tell us this is our collective decision, and we are going to invest on this, and on that. And then I can start as an engineer. I can start planning the infrastructure. I can see what is the impact, what those political decisions imply in terms of new investments to ensure reliability, for instance, at all the levels, from the centralized to the decentralized. And then I can come, and if you are a regulator, you come with a list of additional investments that are necessary to ensure reliability and to make the whole system, energy system, compatible with the policy goals, in particular the decarbonization, but also with the political choices that are being done explicitly. So the big difference, if you want, or what it means, a managed competition or a managed transition, it basically means that the political decisions that have always been political and will always be political are assumed explicitly and not anymore implicitly as it happened in the past.
Claude?
So first, Jorge, your optimism on Prime Minister's understanding of energy markets and what they will decide or not decide on Monday and Tuesday, I don't. I'm more skeptical about this. The reality is that the member states, for example, or some member states are even opposing to mention the ACER report. Whereas they, in a certain sense, this was kicked off all the work which Christian's teams did. So, and why do they are they against even mentioning it in the council conclusions? Because some of the analyses of Christian they don't like this, and they want to do changes which I think are really very dangerous. These changes are not at all going in your sense of going more local and building basically this capacity up. It's just renationalizing in a very blunt way. So I think our fight between now and Monday will be to get the ACER report mentioned, and then maybe mandating ACER to be more concrete on what are the next steps. And I'm pretty sure that in this, the local dimension can also then be taken up. Then on the issue of do prices generate investments? I never believed in the issue that the prices of the wholesale market would basically trigger grid investments, because I think there's very little relations to that. And so I think grid investments is something which needs to be done in a planned way, and we should be. I think we should be very outspoken on that. And the other difficulty is and that's all about what is the value of the price in the wholesale market. I think that the biggest value is basically bringing the electrons in moments of scarcity to the right places. And I don't, maybe it's, I can put up a follow-up question to Christian. I think the price signal, we need it for the short-term intraday basically matchmaking of the electrons, whereas the long-term investments, I think will be decoupled from that short-term or should be. That's exactly what we try to do with long-term PPA arrangements and others. And I think that is a bit my view of how the market should evolve. And maybe a last about honesty. I think the country which has the crudest failure in the managed transition is France. France has an underinvestment of renewables of 15 to 20,000 megawatt. And France has today a nuclear existing park where 27 out of the 54 are out. And there would be even more reactors to be needed to be shut down because they have a systemic corrosion problem, and they are not shutting down, for example, out of the 4 reactors which are standing close to Luxembourg in Kattener, they have shut down 1, and there is no reason why they should not shut down the 3 others. So that is also a part of honesty. And so we are talking in these days about, should Belgium keep 2 nuclear reactors? Should Germany keep 3 nuclear reactors? France has 20, 30, 40 reactors which should be closed down because of a corrosion problem, and nobody speaks about that. And that's a failed transition. That's probably the biggest failed transition because it's so difficult now to repair, and that has a price impact on the whole European market, a huge price impact.
I will tell to Claude that I'm speaking about it 3 times a week since months. But of course, I'm not a European leader. Christian, you were willing to intervene on this, or?
Yeah, just very briefly. I would not have any views on the European Council meeting and the outcome is that what you said. I appreciate your honesty as usual, Claude, but here I would put on my formal hat and just read the conclusions once they magically appear at some point, of course, and we'll see what work, if any, there is there. But on your question, I would agree with you, Claude, that the price signaling function in a situation where you have more intermittent production, I think, is very valuable. So I agree with you that I think we need to preserve, and I think that speaks to the relevance of day ahead and intraday prices reflecting fundamentals, including scarcity. I'm less sure whether there's a full decoupling for longer term signals. I would suspect that day ahead prices still act as some sort of reference, but they're certainly not the only element. There are a number of other elements too, as informed by targets and plans, etc. Some of those elements are the PPA instruments, the investment support in the different sizes and shapes and terms that you mentioned, George, but also the availability of hedging, which I don't think will go away. But okay, this is questionable depending on how we see this development. George, you allude to this. But let's say, okay, you have a significant rise in PPAs, perhaps because the accessibility of PPAs to smaller players is enhanced. I still think there would be hedging needs for those who will bind themselves in contractual obligations under PPAs. So that may have a cascading effect. And actually here in retail markets, if one were to, shall we say, encourage or require retail suppliers to hedge more of their exposure, that would also have a cascading effect, etc. So maybe it's a diversified world we're moving into where longer term markets will still have a role. That is actually my hope, but they won't be the whole story. Thank you.
I'm afraid we will have to close very soon. We got other excellent questions from Angus, from Dirk, and a very excellent one from Tim, but we have to close. And one remark, you have here a real minister, Claude, being a former leader of the parliament. You have the real director of the agency, Jorge as being chairman in Portugal, and of the European Association of Energy Regulators. Vicente, like me, we say what we think because we have the responsibility only of free speech, but you can see that we talk. And we talk to each other so frankly. And this is very typical of the European level, the European layer. The That's the fantastic European level. And I have the same relations with Andries Piebalgs, the former commissioner. And I hope that you enjoy the debate. It's a real debate. It's really tackling the big responsibilities we have on our shoulders as European citizens. And we hope we will make the best of it. But there is institutions, but there is a council, but there is a commission, there is the European Court of Justice, etc. George, you have 2 minutes to close it.
Well, nothing to add, just to thank you all for this very nice discussion. I am an optimist, as Claude said, so I still want to believe that the conclusions will come with a new mandate for ACER, and that we will have the opportunity in a few months from now to be here again and to discuss by then how we are going to implement the reform. Thank you so much to all of you.
Hallelujah, hallelujah, and good luck to the daughter of Frauke Thies. I hope her broken arm will go well. I can see you a broken arm when I was 5, and you see it recovered. So I hope the daughter of Frauke will get as good as me. Have a good day, and why not a good weekend? And Claude, a good meeting next week.